What's up, guys? Today we have a special episode today. I am recording this with my rehab doctor, Dr. Lynn, who's been in the business now. You completed your residency in 1989, so that's
Correct. So,
35, 36 years. And I remember very well being discharged from mission and coming to your acute rehab facility at Saddleback Memorial, where I received care from you. So I want to thank you again for coming on and having this discussion with me. So hopefully we can shed
of
some light on a
course.
few things and answer some questions for some folks out there.
Sure. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. So without further ado, let's get rolling here. I guess the first question that we can just sort of delve into is your personal experience with me as your patient and kind of how that looked to you from day one.
Well, you were, I think, barely 21. So, of course, that's memorable to anybody in rehab because it hits a little closer to home. The therapists in rehab tend to be younger individuals too. So there's a lot of transference and emotional charge when we have somebody that's young. And in our business, 21 is pretty young, certainly not the youngest that we've had, but it affects usually the whole team emotionally. And so everybody's kind of a little amped up because of that. Um, but, when I first saw you, um, I remember you had gone through a lot. You had a tracheostomy, you had a feeding tube, you
Right.
had, just profound weakness. Um, and we were talking a little earlier that your perception was that there was, nothing working. But as a rehab person, I see the potential whereas a patient doesn't see that. They only see their loss. And you can't, most patients aren't, you know, actualized enough to accept it at that moment because they've had such a profound loss of movement, sensation, vision, all those things. That when I focus on meeting a person for the first time, I can see kind of the glimmer of, I wrote in my note that you had a trace amount of extension of your fingers,
Right.
which to me is like a awesome gift at the beginning. So,
Sure.
but it's hard for me to convince that to the patient that, and I'll point it out is that, yeah, you have a little bit of movement there. The patients um, typically don't see what they can do because they can only, look at what they're missing and the change as to what was before. So I remember thinking, it's going to be a big challenge for you. It's going to be, I remember that it was going to be life changing for you, but I wanted to be, positive and upbeat and try to get you through it. And fortunately, your background um, had created kind of a resilient nervous system as well because you were into fitness before you were also into music. All of those things
Right.
cause
Surfing and skateboard, like action sports, probably had a like some level of muscle memory and even nerve memory, I would imagine. I don't know if that's the right
right.
term, but
No, it's all the above. You create different connections between both sides of your brain doing all of those things. So skateboarding and even just working out and get playing guitar and all that
no, right.
creates profound connections that even to this day I'm encouraging my older patients to try to learn something new that is hard. So
Totally.
I'm always trying to to do something new that I'm horrible at that
Yeah.
keep, keeps me a little bit more connected
Yeah.
cognitively and neurologically. So those are all good. And I remember thinking that, even though you were so young, that your youth was going to be um, uh, in the long run helpful for your recovery because you have a long time to get
Right.
better.
So
So
sort of maybe a backhanded blessing, right? Getting ready because, as you know from my book that I have mentioned you in a few times, but the uh, the bittersweet aspect of it, I suppose, looking back now, is well, bitter in the sense that I had so much taken away from me at such a young age, and it really disrupted my life's path and what I thought I was meant to do and where I was headed. But in the long run, as far as recovery is concerned, probably not such a bad thing to have that level of brain plasticity, working in my, to my advantage there. So there's no question. And when I speak with other stroke survivors and folks that have endured things at a younger age, even in their 40s and 50s, um, that's that's a heck of a lot better than say someone who's in their 80s. Or,
sure, yeah,
you know,
and it's huge. And unless the person can really, embrace the challenge or turn it into a positive, um, that's kind of a key to the next step of, actualization is to realize that, you know, having this is a horrible thing and you wouldn't wish it on anybody else, but it creates a resilient, kind of profoundly engaged person that has overcome, a great challenge. And not that everything is easy, certainly not. It's everything is still more of a challenge. But if you survive that, you can take on the world. Is how I look at it. I used to get a lot of um, my spiritual guidance from a lot of my quadriplegic patients who have been basically in a chair for decades. And yet, when I would see them, they would engage me and ask me how I'm doing and how I was always shocked as to how can they be so engaged in, me
sure,
when they're in this situation, and it's because they've accepted it completely and they've given it up and are just in the moment. And that's kind of the key, at least for them.
sure. No, and I'm constantly humbled when I hear stories like that, or I meet individuals that are in a far more challenging situation as far as recovery is concerned, and loss of quality of life and things like that. But I guess, yeah, I suppose the biggest takeaway that is, like you just said, just to echo that, is there is a, and I say this very humbly, but there is a sense of quote enlightenment that I think a lot of people have, whether they've stumbled across it or not. Because a lot of times, like I said, in the beginning, dealing with the full left side paralysis, and you're watching me and going, well, I can see little flares, little twitches, and things that are certainly light at the end of the tunnel. But for me, I still feel like the world's over. My universe came to a screeching halt.
Right.
But I remember you being encouraging, which is nice to hear because it's not always like that. And I certainly, especially after discharge, had my fair share of neurologists and other doctors alike that didn't have such an optimistic outlook on my recovery, and pretty grim. So that's why I kept in touch with you and kept coming back, not to, because at first I was like, is he fooling me? Is he legitimately seeing flare ups in my hand? Because I'm not seeing it. I don't feel it.
Yeah.
And you were talking about earlier how no two strokes are created equal, of course, but
Right.
the particular area in the brain that might occurred, the occipital lobe, and then the bleed reaching into the thalamus area of the brain, which is responsible for not only sensory but motor function. So not being able to feel the whole left side, anyway, it just was a very interesting time. And not that I was being overly harsh on myself or pessimistic, but hearing your words of encouragement were, looking back, extremely valuable to me, because it did give me, whether it was in my own head, uh, not a false sense of hope, but even though I maybe didn't quite believe you, I was like, well, Dr. Lynn, it's maybe he's on to something here, and I can conquer this thing.
Well, when you go through it, when I'm going through it with a patient, I just want them to see what I'm seeing, and I will point it out to say, did you see? Try to, I'll always have them kind of close their fist and then try to open their fist. And if there's some extension, I want them to see it because it doesn't mean much to you. But if I can tell you that if I see it, it's connected to your brain. So that's a pathway we can use. I don't do the same like with the visual cortex and visual loss. The vision part of our brain is so dedicated to visual processing that if you were sighted and reach adulthood, when you have trauma to that area, there's very kind of restricted recovery of that. Maybe on the periphery of the visual loss, you can see some things, but I'm not as gung ho and saying, oh yeah, just keep looking to your left and things will be great, and which I don't. But I want the
Oh, yeah.
patients to I want the patients to realize that for now you can overcome that visual loss by scanning like radar to the lost visual field, and your brain will kind of remember what's over there, hopefully, so that you don't bump into things. So
Oh, yeah.
it I try to be encouraging to what I see. And, you know, if you stayed at the state that the neurologist wanted you to be in at the beginning, you still would not even be walking, is what, I tell people, because they see this kind of block, and this has been damaged, and this is what you got. They'll at least send patients to rehabilitation, but they frequently don't follow them long enough to see them recover. Like
Yeah.
I loved seeing you extend your fingers and to use that hand, and I can see how you have to connect with it visually as you're doing it,
Yeah.
to try to facilitate all that. So I love that because that's your recovery, and that's how you got through all this. And you know and every day it's not like a piece of cake, but
Yeah.
you you certainly keep working at it like everybody else. We all have things that we have to work on as we age, and this now is just part of your core workout stuff, is you know keeping you flexible and moving.
Yeah, 100%. And a lot of those seeds you planted in me are things that I still use to this day, and I help folks out with, whether I'm coaching them one on one, or they just hit me up online and they're looking for some kind of guidance. That is a huge, huge aspect, and a lot of us are used to hearing that. Like said, not all neurologists are bad, but sometimes they're just so textbook about your prognosis for recovery that it's spooky, and it can really
Right,
take the wind out of your sail when it comes.
right. But I think as the neurologists, their role in this is really to diagnose and to tell you what areas of the brain or the computer chip is damaged, yet they don't necessarily um, see the people recover, and they tend to be quite clinical. I tend to, and I don't mean to you know put them in a box, but they tend to be, I call them the engineers of the doctors, and their goal is to kind of figure out where the lesions are and and to treat the lesions, of course. Um, but sometimes after that, you know, they may fall short because they don't follow patients as long as a rehab person
Like
might.
your like
So,
yourself, right? Exactly.
yeah,
And this is at a you said something that sparked a thought in me, and I don't even know that we've ever talked about this, but I'll never forget. Especially being in the rehab facility. You know, allegedly, when I was in a coma, still there was all kinds of talking heads and medical professionals saying things to my family and loved ones, my girlfriend at the time. We can't really tell. He's got brain activity, but he might not remember who you guys are. He might not remember his own name. So for whatever reason, they weren't sure based on CT scans or MRIs. I don't know, but if I was going to have an issue with that, say memory or speech, and I thought that was always interesting to throw that out there while someone's still in an induced coma, when really
right.
yeah, you can have a thought about it, but I mean it was quite the opposite. I came out, I mean, at least cognitively speaking, and mine was all
Right.
physical and visual, the paralysis of the whole left side and the left side visual field cut. But do you know why that would be a, something they'd throw
In
out there to?
in the stress of a critical illness, a lot of the doctors are used to things taking, a bad turn. So in they've become conditioned to hedge their bets and say, we don't know how this is going to happen. We don't, you know, and
Right.
then typically sometime in that period, they'll engage the rehab person to come in, and that's kind of the counterpoint to them. We call that, you know, hanging crepe, which is kind of a throwback to when someone was about to die. They would kind of put black kind of in the room to
Sure.
kind of prepare people. But you know, and I wasn't over at the other hospital when that was going through, but that's pretty typical. Certainly, neurosurgeons and neurologists tend, if somebody's in a coma, they don't know what it's going to be like at the end of the coma. So they'll say, we won't know. And then family will attach to that. And that's the only thing they can hear.
Yeah.
And typically the rehab person then comes in and says, oh, well, when he gets out of here, he's going to go to a rehab center and he's going to do this. And everyone's like shocked that there's also that possibility,
Sure.
you know. And
Yeah.
so that's the difference. The difference is in perception of when the clinician, um, there's I don't know how many times I've had a doctor come up to me and say, I can't believe that you can do what you do, when I think the same about what they do, is that,
Certainly.
I can't believe that you could, treat somebody for a little period of time and then not want to know what happens
Sure.
to them later on. So I think, I always um, think I was probably well suited for rehab based on all that, because can see I think I can see potential, whereas and sometimes it's caused me to trip up, but
Sure.
most of the time one has to be positive to give that to the patient.
100%. Yeah, I mean that's so true, and and just to circle back to that, you know, I was very fortunate enough. I know I came extremely close. I'm not sure if you saw that in my charts. I'm sure you did, but really close to the craniectomy, right? So luckily they didn't have to pop a piece of my skull off.
Right.
Really close at times, and I'm not sure if, because at that time, the pressure, the cranial pressure was so severe, that's when, things get really life threatening and they're going, if we don't
Right.
do this, he could die or, worse, so maybe that's where those anecdotes come into, like,
Right.
we're preparing to cap
Whenever
him. Yeah.
Yeah, whenever there's a lot of infarct in what we call the posterior fossa,
Mhm.
it's kind of a dicey situation because, within the first 72 hours of an infarct, there's swelling of the brain and there's not a lot of space for the
Right.
brain to kind of occupy because of all the bony constriction around that. So if there's even a little bit of pressure on the brainstem, people stop breathing, and then that's
Right.
game over. And fortunately, they didn't have to do a craniectomy and relieve the pressure, which you know is a blessing.
Yeah,
And thank God.
exactly. So, which kind of and there's so many questions I want to ask you, but we'll stick to our regimen here. So I mean, we kind of gone over that, the challenges that my case presented and all of that. I mean, we don't need to really go into all of that, but if there's anything in particular you remember, um,
Well, it's interesting that um, whenever anybody has a stroke, it does affect everything. And the perception of the patient is always interesting to me as to what they recall in it. So um, all strokes affect memory, and although you were able to converse initially, you had some memory problems initially. You had some attention deficit. You had, all those things. And certainly with the vision loss and the sensory disturbance,
yeah,
you had a lot of distractions, you know.
yeah, that might have been an
So,
issue before the stroke too. To be honest, I don't
and
know.
as it
Yeah,
frequently is with a lot of people,
yeah,
and it doesn't, and to me, it doesn't matter because, that is what we got. So we got
yeah,
to work on it. We have to bring one's attention to the task at hand and make
right,
sure that they're focusing on the positive instead of the negative. Because if people get wrapped up in, I can't do this, I can't do that,
yeah,
and you say, but do you see what you did today? And we always bring it back to the present moment. And, you know, when you first got to rehab, you were completely dependent in going from one surface to another,
oh yeah,
which
massively,
means
massively.
we had to lift your body up and move you surfaces. And at the end, you were kind of walking with assistance. So
Yeah,
that's
gate belt.
pretty awesome.
I remember I got in trouble one time because yeah, I thought I could hop out of bed and get myself because I was, it's humiliating. You have nurses
Right.
and everything, and I think it was right when I was sort of done with the whole diaper bedpan situation,
Uh,
which I my heart goes out to anyone who's experienced that. That probably was the hardest and most, as far as psychologically humiliating, as a
right.
young adult dealing with that. You're kind of going, what? But yes. So I suppose
So
that, yeah, go ahead.
you're typically in the club. The majority of patients in your situation would try to, transfer themselves and,
Yeah.
frequently fall. And that's right now, I just use that and try to inoculate the patient before that happens and saying, your brain is going to tell you that you can do these things. And even though I want you to do them eventually, let us help you do it. So every time you do it successfully, we can be there and root you on as opposed to picking you up off the floor
Yeah.
after you've humiliated yourself even further. You know,
Right.
eh, People learn either way, but the idea is certainly with young guys, are going to be more, a little
Rebellious.
problematic in that.
Yeah.
It's not rebellion. It's just like, your brains are wired to be more, aggressive.
Right.
Otherwise, you wouldn't get on a skateboard and jump around like a maniac.
Yeah, exactly. That actually, I remember when I got out, just think, only my right side reacted, and but I had the momentum going. Luckily, from skateboarding, you learn how to fall. And I remember the nurse was really, I just petrified because my bed alarm went off, and I remember I was on the ground like, oh great, you know. And but I knew how to fall and keep my head from smacking the tile of the
Right.
hospital floor. So she came in, she's like, did you hit your head? I'm like, no, I definitely didn't. Like I know what that
Mhm.
feels like from experience. And I was like, I kind of just rolled into my right side, and head's fine, you know. But she was pretty upset with me. I'll never forget that.
Right.
You probably would
And
too.
it's interesting that that's probably a memorable thing for you, but for me, it's part of the whole process of I don't even note it in your discharge summary
Yeah.
because it's such a common
Right.
event.
Right.
But it's a learning event.
Oh,
Is that
totally. Yeah.
you do that once and guess what? You wait and you realize that okay, this I can't do that,
Oh
you
yeah.
know?
And because it was scary, and it was a huge reality check for me and what I was dealing
Right,
with. And I'm going, wow, like I had no chance, and I thought
right,
I'd hit. And
right,
I just remember the nurse saying, like, you can't do this. Like your head's like a fragile little egg. So
right.
you
And
could be in trouble to do this again.
the normal brain works by checks and balances,
Right.
the right side of the brain sees kind of the big picture, the left side of the brain sees the steps involved in it, but you need both together to decide if something is safe or not. So your movement was not good, but you know your your right side was under the weather and was not kind of saying, "Oh yeah, we got this."
Oh yeah.
No, it was not keeping up with the left side of your brain, which said, "Oh, I was transferring with PT today, and it was easy
Yeah. I mean,
until
yeah.
you try to do it without having
Yeah,
somebody right there."
you'd think I would have known because even that was tough with the gate belt and everything. But you just, yeah, your mind, the way of
Right,
thinking is just like, well, I got this. And
right.
I think maybe part of that I carried with me, and I'm not recommending this to anybody, but that almost naivete approach, like, oh, I got this, overly confident, borderline delusional about my own prognosis. Um, might have helped, but I was also
Yeah, I think it's always good to be kind of positive and be engaged, certainly with and the therapist, hopefully the therapists keep people kind of encouraged to keep working at it and challenging them by increasing the degree of difficulty. And so patients who are kind of swept along that progression, hopefully are seeing progress, and that's why we always tend to, we conference a patient every week and discuss their improvements and give it back to the patient to say this week you walked 100 feet with us holding on, and that's great. And when you started, you were dependent in
Sure.
transfers and mobility, and so
Yeah,
you're making progress, and it will continue, but we got a lot of work to do, obviously, and keep them engaged, you know.
100%. So that's actually a good that's a good point. So was there any, I mean, gosh, I don't expect you to remember every little thing. It's been over 15 years now. October 21st, 2009, right? So
Right.
now in almost in March of 2025, which is just banana. That's just so
Yeah.
crazy. So it's been just over 15 years. So I don't expect you to remember uh, every little thing, but is there any pivotal moment when I was still coming in for regular checkups in the beginning, especially where you went, oh wow, like Kevin can do this now? I saw him a few months
I
ago.
think yeah, I think every time I had seen you in the office, I was noticing positive recovery, even though the vision is still, you know, what it is. You're seeing about half the world, but you adapt to it, and from an external viewpoint, you're seeing everything that everybody else sees, but you do it differently. You have to scan the environment,
Yeah,
and you're a little bit
different.
slower. Yeah, you're a little bit slower than many, but um, but that's the success is there. So I was have always thought that you were a kind of a positive kind of worker, and I think that's just tends to be your nature, and um, and it would have been a shame if somebody took away, your forethought that you couldn't improve. I mean that's almost criminal in my mind that
Totally.
you can't take away someone's hope. You know,
100%. And I
you
appreciate
can't
that.
encourage. Yeah, as a clinician, I shouldn't encourage something that I don't think is going to happen. So that's why I tend not to focus on vision and say, "Oh yeah, your vision's going to come back," which I usually say, "Well, we wait 6 months to see how it comes back," but it typically comes back just in a limited fashion if it does recover.
Right.
Um, and sometimes I'll, unless I get asked a question directly, I may not necessarily volunteer things unless somebody asks me. You know,
Right. Yeah, because I'm sure there is an aspect of, you know, what doesn't I hate to, this is probably the wrong phrase, but what doesn't kill you makes you stronger kind of thing. And it's
right?
probably better left unsaid if there is any aspect to the recovery that there are just it's too difficult to answer. I went down the rabbit hole of researching the whole vision thing and very proud to say my vision's improved tremendously. But yeah, there's no
Mhm.
question there's still some level of compromised vision there.
Right, right.
Having that said, I've seen stories where people after 5 years, 10 years, all of a sudden it just snaps back. And that is
Yeah,
fascinating to me, how that would happen.
right. And I think, some of that, all of our brains are wired a little bit differently, and that there may be some people that have a condition that's called synesthesia, where your senses are connected in different ways. Some people can see words and see colors associated with those words, or
Right.
there's these abnormal connections. Oliver Sacks writes about it a lot in some of his books. He's a neurologist that wrote Awakenings and a lot of interesting novels, but it may have to do with the individual's brain
Yeah.
even prior to the stroke event. So
Sure.
it's pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting. If you have a person that's congenitally blind, the visual cortex will be taken up by auditory neurons, and the auditory system takes over. So
Right.
that's their own echolocation. And so the brain is pretty amazing in how it can be plastic, but it is somewhat dependent on the age and the time of development and a lot of those things. So,
Right.
the key is continuing to engage with the environment, to work in the environment, move in the environment, and have the environment give you feedback. If you miss something in your left visual field, guess what? You're going to bump into it, or you're you're going to
Done that plenty of
scrape the
times.
car.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And
Right.
you don't even have to have a stroke to have that happen. I've got enough bruises that show that when I'm focused on something else. Yeah.
Right. And this brings up something that I've been meaning to do, and maybe we can talk about this offline, but very curious if I were to get, because I think the last time I've had an MRI, I was doing a research study with UCI Medical. I was doing
Yeah.
Howard the robotic arm study.
Right.
A lot of because of all that I've gotten back, and it's been, pretty successful given given the level of brain damage, I'm honestly curious, has there been new neural growth in that portion of dead brain matter, or has my brain just rerouted and now there's a new area of my brain taking over for the movement of my left side or the vision?
Well, it's an interesting question. We definitely know that there's been improvement in your brain.
Sure.
If and typically when we see things like that, we don't see the infarcted tissue
Growing in
sprouting.
life.
It,
Right.
yeah, we don't usually see that that's and they do a lot of these studies with what's called functional MRI, where they kind of tag glucose molecules and see what areas of the brain are active, and it's quite the common process in kind of research studies. Clinically, not so much, but in research studies, they'll look at this. And what we typically will see is that the periphery of the stroke is going to be more active, and that's the neighbors of this infarcted tissues are now doing
Picking
the
up.
job
Yeah.
of yeah,
Yeah.
and that's one of the interesting things for um, typically older patients with strokes is that the penumbral tissue or the tissue around the periphery kind of recovers. That's the rehabilitated neurons. But those guys are working overtime to try to do their job and take care of their neighbors' duty, and they're doing the best that they can. And it becomes clinically uh, significant if that patient has like a mild infection or a urine infection or pneumonia, something like that, that brings the whole system down. And you'll see that the, they're so weak that that penumbral tissue won't work as efficiently as it had rehabilitated to. So typically I'll have families calling me and say, "Oh, I think, Joe's had another stroke because he's just like how he was 3 years ago."
Okay.
And I said, "So what was going on before?" And, typically it'll turn out to be a urine infection, and then you just treat them
Interesting.
and those neurons bounce back because I call it the weak link in the system. The weak link is the rehabilitated neurons. And so they're doing their best to keep up. But if things, get backed up, it's like Lucille Ball on the chocolate
Yeah.
sorting machine,
A great
things
reference.
just
Yeah.
things just keep falling apart. And so
Sure.
they're frequently happy to hear that because the family's only experience is this is what happens with a stroke, and they think, oh my God, he's had another stroke. And, it typically is not. It's just rehabilitated neurons.
Sure. I get that a lot, and I certainly remember the fatigue, right? The neural fatigue. So
Hmm.
is it
Right.
possible, or is this what you're saying, that because of that surrounding brain tissue, brain matter, the surrounding neurons picking up the slack for the stroke affected area of the brain, because of that neural expenditure, that extra fight that the surrounding tissue is giving, does that then cause additional neural fatigue and make you just feel like, I mean, so
Right.
many times I had to take a midday nap. I'm like, I gotta lay
Oh,
down
right. That's
now.
one of the biggest symptoms
Yeah,
of this. And I think that's why is that as neurons, do their business, their neurotransmitters get depleted. So if they're doing overtime, guess what? The packets of neurotransmitters are releasing smaller amounts, and so the only way to bounce back from that is to recharge. Basically, take naps or
totally.
spread things out. Don't be as aggressive, but the brain kind of reverts to kind of a kind of childlike, more infantile recovery, and that you'll sleep more. And I encourage people to do that as long as they're sleeping at night. You know,
Exactly. So getting my circadian rhythm back in check was probably one of the more it was one of the hardest feats, but one of the more
Mm,
helpful ones also when it came to really regaining my normal level of energy levels. Uh, going to bed at the same time every night, waking up at the same time every morning, and not oversleeping. Obviously, I think in the beginning, the more the merrier. I don't know how
mm.
long that goes for, a few months, but eventually you have to kind of snap out of it because I was sleeping 12 hours a night and I could
Right,
still wanted to sleep when I'd wake up. But dialing in that sleep cycle where it's like, okay, you got your 8 or maybe even 9 hours. It's time to get up and get moving. And it's
right.
hard to really, really tough to snap into form there. But
Well,
once
I think part of that is our culture does not really value sleep as much as it should, and I think we're beginning to appreciate that. Um, there are great books out like Why We Sleep now by Dr. I think it's Walker that wrote this book. Is an amazing read about the importance of sleep and how regenerative it is and how it cleans up our brain in the deep stages and what a valuable asset that is. But in our culture of you know uh, everybody has to be successful and everybody has to be burning the midnight oil and and they are multitasking and we talk as if that's the end all.
and that's
Well,
what
it
things should be.
probably isn't.
Probably not.
Yeah,
Yeah, and you're
yeah,
probably compromising some level of productivity in the sense
right,
that burning the candle at both ends, as they say. Uh,
right. And I've certainly done that in my past, but just in the last 5 years, I've tried to make more conscious effort of um, having a set sleep schedule and wake schedule to just have your brain, have some boundaries so that by the time the sunset occurs, I'm kind of getting ready for sleep already.
right.
you
At the
know,
very least, yeah, like have dinner, and that's a whole other
yeah,
thing we could talk for a long time about because
right,
I'm all about this stuff right now. But having earlier dinners and allowing a few hours, 2, 3 hours,
right, to digest before you go to sleep. Yeah, key, definitely key.
key,
Excuse me.
key stuff. So I guess, I'm just out of curiosity, has my case, if it has, how has it maybe influenced other cases after me? Have you had anything similar where it changed maybe or influenced your approach to other patients?
I have. I think the importance for your case and just my assimilation of your recovery is that one has to encourage the patient to continue. And I try to tell them, you got to work at this every day. Just like I have to go to the gym and I have to work on my cardio and I have to work on my flexibility because I'm a stiff old, Medicare guy now. And so, um, you know, everybody has things that they need to work on. And so for you, I could always see that you were working on everything continually. And that's exactly what I think people need to do. And you did it and you've succeeded, not that you're 100%, I'm not saying that, but at the same time,
Right.
you're quite functional, you're branching out, you're um, leaving your impact in the world, not necessarily where you thought when you were 21,
Right.
but where the world wants it, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the key thing. I've I've had, a lot of my patients I see over the span of decades. And so with that, I've seen people that come in with a propensity for stroke because they have like gene mutations or it's similar to your situation or gene mutations that increases their risk of stroke that's not 100% correctable with medication. I've seen them stroke out their language area, and 10 years later, they've had recovery in their language area and they're able to converse and get along with the family at home. It's certainly not normal speech, but like 10 years later, they'll have a new stroke area because of their condition. And that stroke area is in a part of the brain that has nothing to do with language. And
Sure.
I'll see that their language will be affected by the new stroke, which tells me, okay, well, their language recovered by
Right.
moving it to this part of the brain. So our brains are smart in figuring those things out. So if you continue to challenge yourself and engage the environment, the world, and speak and, problem solve and, move in the environment, then, your brain will adapt as best that it can, and
100%.
that's
And
what we got to do.
yes, and that's where, in the last speech I gave too, the biggest question, because I think sometimes it can seem on the outside, you know, probably more so to the untrained eye, right? But
Mhm.
that I'm 100% recovered. And while I think it's extremely difficult to put a percentage on, say, my recovery or, as opposed to maybe someone else, my biggest thing is I've been able to recover 100% of my life back. Does that mean that
Right.
100% of the side effects are no longer with me? No, absolutely not.
Right.
But I figured out how to, with the things that I lost, music. Okay, I figured out how to play music again. Getting in the ocean and riding waves, figured out how to do that again. Getting on a bicycle, the list goes on. Making a living. Um, so there's nothing that really holds me back. I just did a 13
Right.
mile hike up in the Saddleback mountain range that, many, I'm not tooting my own horn here, but many fully able-bodied people in this day and age would have a hard time with. So
Oh,
it's
for
like
sure.
you got to draw the line in the sand somewhere and be realistic. It's like define 100% recovered. It's really up to you and
Mm.
how you decide to live life post traumatic brain injury, post stroke, whatever it
Right.
may be. So for me, I was able to reclaim 100% of my life. Yeah, certainly, there's it was a doozy, right?
Right.
They don't put people in medically induced coma for nearly a month if it's just
Right.
a minor ordeal. So, without taking the wind out of any other patient's sail or bursting their bubble, it's kind of like, well, no, I mean, I'm so accustomed to the paralysis that I've had to deal with and my recovery. I don't even really think about it anymore. I just get up and go
Right.
and do my thing. Yeah, I could harp on every little thing, be like I'm not 100%. My left side isn't 100% yet, and that's
Right.
just that goes nowhere, right?
And there are people that can't get over that.
Yeah,
And you were fortunate that you have accepted, your limitations, but use that as a stepping stone. But
sure.
other people cannot um, get over that. And I call that an ego dystonic disability. And it's a big problem. And I'll see some patients in consultation. Usually it's many years after a stroke, and they can't deal with their deficiencies
Right.
as they are. They want someone's conditioned them up to that point that you go to a therapist and the therapist will give them exercises and it's supposed to make it better. But, I try to reframe that to be the therapists are there to show you how to manage this and how to work on it. But, a therapist working 3 times a week at, a half an hour to 45 minutes
Ain't gonna do
is
it.
not going to change your life.
Right.
But that's the workout mentality that we all need to get stronger in the world. We have to, and I just
Right.
put it in that frame. It's a workout. Your workout has to do with different things than my workout does, you know. And,
Right.
as long as they keep working that, but a lot of people just are overwhelmed with that concept and they can't deal with it, just like many people can't work out. They just don't think of it, you
Yes,
know.
exactly. And you said to me once, and I've taken this with me, we as the patients are technically speaking the expert of our own recovery. These seeds that are planted by, you know, guys like yourself, rehab doctors, PTs, OTs, whoever, personal trainers, coaches, people that are there to help you. These seeds are planted, but yeah, a half hour, 3 days a week isn't gonna do it. And even when I went to the stroke boot camp, and while it was helpful, it really the takeaway was, okay, I got to do this stuff on my own and make it almost like a religious practice and something that a lifestyle that I adhere to daily, day in, day out, and get
Right.
creative with your recovery so you don't get bored. Because a lot of times, you playing with ping pong balls and putting them in Dixie cups all day will drive you mad.
Sure.
Like one of the worst things, and most frustrating things. So it's like, okay, how can I mess around with other little devices or do
Right.
some kind of movement or exercise that's going to make me not only heal and get better, but I was also obsessed with. I'm like, I just want to feel good. I want to like get my athletic build back. I want to feel confident and feel strong in my skin. So that's where I really jumped into this whole, fitness for the injured,
I
brand
think it's awesome.
developed.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
it's needed. We gotta continue the encouragement of, everybody to have their own program because everyone's program is going to be different. you know.
absolutely. It could be video games for someone, say, hey,
Right.
fiddle around with that, a few hours a day. If it doesn't drive you nuts, do whatever works that's going to be triggering the response, from the
Right.
brain to the affected side and so on and so forth. So this is really good stuff. But I want to be respectful of your time. So, really, okay. So our next section is your experience as a rehab doctor. What inspired you to specialize in rehabilitation medicine?
Yeah. That's kind of I didn't really realize it until I was much older and um, probably in analysis um, that when I was growing up, I was the youngest of three kids. My sister um,
Here.
was 18 and I was 12 when she was involved in a motor vehicle accident and died of a brain injury. Um, and I remember getting the phone call of my dad at age 12 because my mom and the rest of the family were in a certain place and my sister was driving to us. And I remember getting that phone call and I could tell that from my dad's tone that something horrible had happened. And then we learned that my sister had died. I kept that as a 12-year-old with, as 12-year-olds think that somehow it was kind of my fault because I answered the phone.
Oh, yeah.
And that kind of stuck with me my entire life. I also happened to be living with my grandfather who had a tracheostomy and a laryngectomy and spoke with an artificial larynx and um, was medically complicated, soon thereafter, so I grew up in that kind of an environment that I was close to people that were on the fringe of having abnormal health things. So, that kind of led me. I thought I was going to be a researcher, like a neuroscience researcher. And when I was trying to decide between going into kind of laboratory medicine, neuroscience that way, or something else, um, I realized that I couldn't work in a lab forever because I needed more engagement. And so, as a secondary thought, I decided I would apply to medical school, and like an idiot, I didn't realize that I couldn't. I applied for three medical schools and, accidentally got in one, is how I look at it, because I was, I just thought, oh, I'll just do that instead, which was not an easy thing, but I wasn't even pre-med, and went to UCI, and I didn't know where UCI was. I didn't know it was in, I just remember I grew up in Bakersfield, driving by Irvine in the middle of Orange County where they had the Fluor building off in the distance. And I remember that was Irvine, but I didn't really know it was close to the beach or anything like that. So,
Right.
so when I eventually went into rehabilitation, it connected with me so much. We did a 3-week rotation where I had a patient who had a stroke from the beginning, and I followed their recovery, and I thought that was, amazing. Later on, 20 years later, I realized, well, that's fixing that damaged 12-year-old kid
Right.
that thought
Wow.
that he caused all this, and fortunately I found some career that I feel I've been helpful at, and it paid me a living, and and now I'm kind of backing out and doing it kind of part time, but still doing it.
Yeah.
So I think that's important. So I think it just connected with a part of me, which I think is why some of the other doctors think, well, how can you do this? Isn't it depressing? And to me, no, it's not depressing. The depression uh, part is if you think people don't get better, that would be depressing. But even the most impaired person can have functional improvement, that improves their quality of life.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. That's it's a heavy story to say the least. But it makes sense to me that your background and dealing with that level of trauma and emotional stress at such a young age played a huge part in your approach, not only your path in life, but you also your approach to medicine in general. And that's why I connected with you. I mean, in the very beginning, I think every patient has frustrations with just about everybody who's trying to help them,
Yeah.
doctors, family members, loved ones alike. But it's without a doubt, as tragic as that was, it's very it's inspiring and not a shock to me that you ended up as a successful rehab doctor and helping.
Right. And I think, yeah, I think that was, part of the grand scheme of things, and that's my lesson in my life, that I wouldn't have wished, a family circumstances like that on any other family. But looking back at it, I realized that that was the formulative part that created, the defect or the damage in me, which is just like, you know, the stroke. And then
Yeah,
by adapting to that is what, lets you recover and thrive, basically. So,
sure. I mean, it was it's a contagious, if in a good way, obviously, it's a contagious philosophy that you had that kind of radiates through you as a doctor to hopefully all your patients. I mean, certainly was for me, but I mean, I can imagine you've had thousands of patients throughout your career, and so I'm sure there's a lot of other folks out there like myself where you feel that legitimate, care and, the delivering of information.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
And I mean, I can only imagine things have evolved quite a bit since you started in the late 80s, early 90s. So is there any big leaps that you care to note as far as recovery?
Well, I remember in medical school, we used to think that, well, we were taught that the brain doesn't, you know, grow neurons. The brain is fixed in time. But even though I was taught that in medical school, I had been working in um, uh, brain science at UCSD, and I happened to work in a laboratory where the physician was actually discovering that the hippocampus was actually making new neurons, which we know the hippocampus is the kind of important part of the brain that stimulates memory. So, fortunately, I happened to be working in that lab so that when I got into medical school, when the professors would say, well, this is the brain is, what it is, it's fixed as you're an adult. And when they would tell me that, a stroke is kind of a permanent thing, and they said, well, the brain doesn't recover that way. I knew that that was incorrect.
You had
So
reservations about that. So you were working on
yeah,
cutting edge, sort of medicine sort.
yeah. So I think I just kind of discounted that and I just ignored it, because even in rehab, when I went through rehab, I saw people actually functionally improving. So I knew the process was helpful, at least with the function. I didn't actually know at the time that the brain was uh, growing new neurons, which we know. The hippocampus and the olfactory bulb can actually grow new neurons, and certain things can stimulate brain-derived neurotropic factors that kind of encourage all that stuff. So, and one of the biggest things is exercise, which goes along with everything we've always heard.
Yeah.
Uh, so
Yeah. I
more
mean,
power to
certainly,
people.
yeah. I mean, thank God you had your reservations, whether it was from working in San Diego or not, but it's, you probably had those reservations prior to that, but then exploring that sort of new field, going, hey, maybe it's not all bad from here. There's
Right.
some hope in people's ability to recover, and that's amazing. That I mean, it's funny because even when I experienced my stroke at the end of 2009, even then, well, you being my rehab doctor was like, this ain't over yet. There's a lot we can do to get you to recover. But I could only imagine if it was 20, 30 years prior to 2009,
Right.
it would have just been
Right.
like, well, you're gonna have to learn how to do everything with just your right side, and just live with it. That's an
And that's kind of what we did initially. It's just
Sure.
functional training with the intact side, and a lot of patients that have right-sided brain strokes do have that neglect, and so it just kind of goes along with that neglect. But
Right.
um, a lot of the the recovery of patients is to kind of get them through that neglect part, so that they have the weaker extremity be part of them again, because it gets divorced from their body a lot at the
Yeah,
beginning.
very, very. It's a bad breakup. It's a bad divorce,
Yeah.
and it's one I don't wish upon anybody. But
Yeah.
again, in my is I guess I was pretty stubborn about. I mean, I think for the longest time, I was like, I didn't have a stroke. I was absolutely clinically uh, clinical denial.
Right.
I just didn't know what I was up against. I remember the OT at Saddleback. I was talking to her, and I was like, "Yeah, no, I'll be surfing in like 6 weeks." No idea what I was up against. Absolutely zero clue. Uh,
When that a patient says that, then we usually focus on the here and now. And it's like, well, today we're working about getting your balance, when you're standing from the chair. So why don't we work on that? And
exactly.
you have to
Crawl before you can walk.
re-steer them. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
walk before we run. So you basically covered some of this, but you're over you're what's your overarching philosophy when treating patients with traumatic injuries, whether it seems like you have a lot of traumatic brain injury, a lot of stroke patients.
mm,
But your philosophy and your approach, you pretty much covered. And I think a lot of it seems to be putting the power back in the patient's hands, allowing them to have a sense of, I don't want to speak for you, but just what I've gathered, allowing them to have a sense of expertise and playing a role in this, because a lot of times uh, there's just such an overwhelming sense of helplessness. And
right.
so you're just constantly looking to other people for answers. And, when can I get this back? When will I be 50%? When will I be 80%?
Mhm.
Um, so, yeah,
When somebody always asks me, okay, what percentage is my recovery? And my response these days is, you're 100% right now, and this is what we've got, but we need to change. And so I don't like them, because every time they compare themselves with before stroke or after stroke, or before brain injury and after brain injury, that's an added burden to the patient, is
right.
that they're always doing that comparison, and that comparison is not good.
It's a thief of
And
joy.
there's a lot of Buddhist kind of tales eh, about adding additional burdens onto the individual, when you just got to throw that off. And I always tell them, you're 100% perfect as you are, but we're going to work on this.
Right.
And it seems hokey and it seems ridiculous, but
No,
um,
it's very,
you got to keep the focus on that they're perfect as they are, because we're right here right now, and we're breathing and living and communicating and doing all that, and that's a blessing. But we can work on other things. So
100%. Yeah, very well said. And there's no question that, you know, that's what I try, and the folks that I work with one on one, it's kind of like, look, they're having a down day or a down week or down month. A lot of times there's just this depression and even anxiety that, we slip into as a patient because of the fear of the unknown. And it's a very solid reminder to kind of sit back and go, wait a minute, this thing could have taken me out. In fact, it takes most people out. The fact that I survived it all is a win. So clearly my work isn't done here on Earth. So I think that's a great way to sort of look at it. It's like, hey, that was a battle that we were sort of just thrown into without any warning. No one's prepared for something like that. It's not even like, I've made the comparison before. Uh, when someone joins the military or the police force or anything like that, you are, to some degree, you have to be mentally prepared to know that, hey, this could result in the worst case scenario, death or some really severe injuries that could be life altering. So it's an interesting thing for a total civilian, right, who is not engaging in a line of work that's dangerous per se, to just be, you're living your life, and all of a sudden it's like, you just get zapped neurologically, for me with the stroke, for
right,
millions of other people. And you're kind of going, well, I wasn't prepared. I didn't enlist in the military. Like, how did this happen?
right, right,
Right. So there's far less preparation You're not saying goodbye to loved ones every morning going, hey, hopefully I see you later.
Right.
It's very interesting. So I think from a psychological standpoint, that's where a lot of this depression and lack of faith in the patient's ability comes into play because they go, this wasn't supposed to happen to me,
Right.
and it's like,
Right.
well, yeah, it's a hard thing to go, this was supposed to happen to me, but I started adopting the mindset of, maybe it's interesting. It's not like some self-fulfilling prophecy or self-fulfilling idea, but maybe I was, chosen in some weird sense to
Hmm.
fight this fight. And it's empowering when you think about it that way because
Right.
it puts you back in the driver's seat.
Right. And I try to tell my patients that if they can look at it as a gift, because it has given people positive things, even though there's a whole list of negative things, but there
Sure.
are positive things that come out of it that I think if you look at that aspect of it as a gift, it helps you to keep working the challenge. And, you
100%.
know, it's, nothing that we would wish on anybody, but, you know, it, stuff happens, as they say. That's not what they say, but,
Yeah.
you know.
There's an expletive in there, I think, somewhere. That's all right. Um, so that's really your overall philosophy. Another big thing that I'd like to address is what would uh what would you give patients and caregivers, starting their recovery journey? Is there any kind of, because that's another aspect of it. Um, Caregivers, other people that are trying to help out. Is there any sort of nuggets of wisdom you can shed on us for that?
Yeah, well, the issues with caregivers is that the caregivers, you know, are trained from the outset to help the person, but they can help too much. They don't let the person struggle. The key is allowing the patient to struggle enough that they get some benefit out of it before they get too frustrated. But I see, frequently spouses will step in if their spouse has had a stroke or something, and they'll end up doing everything for them to the point that there's a learned helplessness that also occurs when they could have recovered. And, it has to do with their way of their love language, basically helping them to do everything. And sometimes they can help too much. And you basically have to point it out to them that you know you can back off a little bit and let them work at it a little while, but you may have to separate yourself. Like when they need to put on their socks, just give them the socks and give them some time, but don't just stand there and wait. Give them enough
Right.
time that they can struggle
Right.
because
And even
they'll
sometimes,
jump in.
right. And sometimes that can even, I've found in my experience when someone's really staring at you, whether it's putting on socks, getting dressed, preparing a meal, going on a walk, when you feel like someone's just staring at you, you end up not doing your best work because then you're kind of
Right,
nervous, you
right,
know.
right.
And
The normal human reaction.
sure. And then there's also, the other aspect, and I'm curious your thoughts on this as well. I tread lightly in this department because I never want to come off as saying, hey, you should really push it to the point where, someone could accidentally hurt themselves. But I did notice, I only had so much allotted PT before I was sort of released on my own, which is why I got so obsessed with the fitness thing. So I'm like, clearly I got to do all this on my own now and get creative. But maybe it's a liability thing, but I think sometimes caregivers or even certain PTs, people trying to help, um, might even hold patients back a little. But then again,
Hmm.
this is a trick. This is a sticky one because you have folks that maybe are a little bit more frail on the older side, don't have a fitness
Right.
background. So it's like you want them to push it because I think that there's certain limitations that they appear to be limitations on the outside, but mentally, you know that you can work towards this specific goal. Not like earlier when we were talking about when I tried to get out of bed and use the commode on my own in the hospital, way too soon. But when you're discharged and you've gone through PT and learned a few things, safely pushing the limits and not being afraid to really, expand on your recovery in ways that I think sometimes, certain experts will go, whoa, 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 whoa. And it's just like, well, they might have learned something there. You don't want them to
Uh,
fall and break something, but I don't know what your take is.
right. Well, it's on a case by case basis. What you would encourage someone who's young, 20s to 50s versus, you know, 80-year old. I mean, it's different, but we do know that the body responds to the same physical challenges up to any age, so 90s plus, that the body still responds the same way to the challenge. Of course, the challenge, uh, you know, for uh, for us let's say just doing squats, but for somebody 80, if they do just a chair squat, standing up from a chair, that does the same work.
Yeah,
And we find that some of the cultures that are most fit are the ones that are most active, walking up and down hillsides and doing a little gardening and, just staying active, you know.
right,
And in our culture, we don't really have that. So we have to kind of make it. But definitely, um, you try to encourage, the challenge as safely as you can. But if you have an older patient with a stroke and they fracture, then that tends to be a death sentence. So that
right.
tends
That totally
you
makes
don't get too many of those and not feel that caution. So that's kind of where a lot of people in rehab would be coming from. But you know, that's why I try to encourage the patient to try to be safe, but push themselves because they know, right?
right.
Hopefully
Yep,
by that time.
100%. No, that's very true. So that's great insight. And then, really just, lastly, I know it's not the rehab doctor's place necessarily, but is has have you found that nutrition and certain lifestyle has improved people's level of recovery? Uh, this seems kind of like an obvious one to
Yeah, I think um, nutrition is such a challenging thing for Americans in general because of our food system that, I could go down the rabbit hole and, you know, go through all of that and don't want to. But, I'll encourage them to do research. You know, Uh, they have some great podcasts that are out there in terms of nutrition, and that I'll have them kind of focus on that. Certainly, um, the studies are basically showing that now we're usually in the field of being over fed in general. And most of the studies are showing that for improved longevity, you need to calorie restrict the
yeah,
the animal, individual, cell, yeast, whatever. If you calorie restrict it, they tend to live longer. Well, it's kind of engaging these survival circuits that basically get rid of the old cells, the defunct cells,
Right.
the zombie cells is what it is. And so we're in a process of beginning to learn more about that scientifically, and they have a lot of good kind of websites for that. I'm just coming off a 36-hour fast,
Oh
and
wow.
I do that every week to try to reset
Once a
kind of
week.
my
Oh wow. 36
once a
hours.
week. And
Okay.
yeah, but and the studies are showing that that's probably a good way to reset a lot of your chemical markers. Now, if you have a patient that's having a hard time getting enough calories in general, I have no problem getting calories. But,
Yeah.
if I have a patient that is is a challenge and is not eating, I would certainly not do that because
Right.
they're automatically calorie restricting. But
Yeah.
having 3 meals a day is not kind of our genetic history.
Right.
That's kind of a new addition. And so we need to kind of learn from kind of the new science that's coming out in terms of all that good stuff. So,
Absolutely. And I've actually seen a lot on that, and I should probably be better about it. I do a lot of the intermittent fasting, so my feeding, I'll try to keep it to just 8 hours within a 24-hour
right,
period.
right.
I have done an 36 hour fast before.
Hmm.
It's definitely not something I do regularly. But I
Hmm.
did see something on that recently. It just sounds like the body will sort of mop up all these zombie cells, like you said,
Right.
you know, broken, I guess, cells that they need to be, it allows the body to sort of chew them up. I almost picture like Pac-Man, that old cartoon.
And that's exactly what probably happens. That is, as you know, for our systems, we're either in a fed state or our cells individually realize that there's enough nutrition around that they can grow,
Right.
okay? Or we have a nutritional deficiency, we can't grow, we really need to conserve and we need to kind of mop up. So it's either an on or off. And in the growth phase, that's when, the organism can uh, breed or genetically duplicate, um, grow new cells, including cancer. And if the off state is there, then it typically causes a regression of precancerous cells, these zombie cells, nutritionally resets. Um, there's a lot of good information coming out of, there's a David Sinclair from Harvard
Familiar.
has written some interesting things. His book Lifespan, I think, is kind of fascinating read. I'd put it up with the book of Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker as being kind of the modern manual for kind of just resetting our brains.
Sure.
But there was an interesting podcast on Zoe, which talks about fasting states and intermittent fasting and versus more kind of low level fast that was kind of interesting that I just listened to. So you may actually like that
Yeah.
a bit. It's called Zoe, Zoe.
ZOE. So
Yeah.
those are okay. So those are three good books you mentioned. Maybe just one more time. So Dr. David Sinclair's book, Lifespan, is that what
Called
it's
Lifespan. Yeah.
Lifespan? Then, so
And then Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep.
okay.
Um, and this uh, nutrition Zoe is kind of looking at the microbiome and
Yeah.
kind of is one of the biggest things that did crowdsourcing for initially for COVID, but they found that they had all these people connected for COVID intervention and were able to kind of tease out some nutritional things, and they've done further research on that. So it's um, provided a lot of interesting kind of information uh, based on the problem with nutrition science is that um, it's so convoluted in what people are eating, and
Right.
you can't make a person eat the same thing every day, but you have to kind of crowdsource what people are eating and they have looked at their microbiomes to see their nutrition and what is basically at play in their gut microbiome that
Sure.
helps them be more resilient, less reaction to kind of autoimmune diseases and things like that. So
Sure. Yeah.
it's pretty fascinating stuff.
I can only imagine that fermented foods is a part of that book. I would
Oh,
imagine I've seen a lot of,
completely. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
fermented
And
foods and soluble fibers.
you
Yeah.
bet.
Yeah.
I did Zoe has a nutritional analysis where they'll check your blood glucose response. They'll check your gut transit time. They'll take a genetic sample of your microbiome and give you an analysis. And so I did it just as an educational thing for me and found that my, glucose tolerance was pretty horrendous and my fat tolerance was pretty horrendous. But my gut microbiome was like in the 93rd percentile
Oh, wow.
of diverse organisms. And the only thing
Nice.
I could think of is that, for years I've been, making sourdough bread and I've made
Okay.
sauerkraut. I have, at any time, I have sauerkraut that is in the refrigerator that I've made kombucha and I have my SCOBY in the kitchen at all times. So, that our guts are like a coral reef that the more diversity you have, the more resilient I think people can be.
Yeah,
And in terms of healthy living, I think that's a key, but we're beginning to learn more about that as we go forward. So stay tuned.
absolutely. And yes, definitely. And there's that makes a lot of sense to me. The ecosystem being broadly diverse, it makes sense to me that that can only be of benefit. So
Right.
yeah. Well, those are sounds like three really good reads. So I will definitely personally check them out, and anyone
Check
listening.
them out. They're on audiobooks too, so that's even better.
Huge fan. I mean, I
Yeah.
like to read, but especially that's why I took this book, which you're well aware of, and I decided to do an audio because reading
Right.
was a
It's a
challenge.
challenge.
It was
Yeah.
good to do for the exercise of my eyes and tracking and getting all that dialed in, but it was exhausting. So nice to be able to get through a book without it feeling like such a chore. So audiobooks
You're here.
definitely not a bad thing. Well, Dr. Lynn, it's been a pleasure, as usual, having a
Thank you.
conversation with you. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap things up here?
I think that's enough for the day.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I can
I could go down the rabbit hole forever, but those are
100%.
kind of the things that's on my mind today.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your time and I think this is gonna be really helpful for a lot of ears out there.
I hope so.
And hopefully can get you on maybe in a few months or in a year from now. There's something
All
new
right.
we might need to
Ho-
share with.
hopefully something new or another turn in the rabbit hole.
Indeed. Okay. Well, Dr. Lynn, thank you
Alrighty.
again.
Ciao.
We'll be in touch. Okay.
All right. Take care.
Cheers.